Welcome to another Apollo Papyrus episode. I am Aaron Apollo Camp. For this episode, my interview guest was adopted as a very young infant and is the author of the memoir Abandoned at Birth, which is about her efforts to find her biological mother as an adult. Her name is Janet Sherlund, and here's my interview with Janet. Janet Sherlund, welcome to Apollo Papyrus.
Thank you so much. I'm so happy to be here.
You've served on nonprofit boards in education, health, and the cultural arts. What boards did you serve on, and what was serving on those boards like?
Gosh, I've been a volunteer for, most of my adult life. So that would be a lot of boards to talk about hospitals, schools, etc. Maybe I can choose the last couple, and that will be easier. Currently, I'm serving on the board of Fairwinds Behavioral Health Center here on Nantucket Island in Massachusetts. And we are, as it says, the mental health agency on Nantucket, providing services to anyone regardless of their ability to pay. And I'm also a trustee emerita of the Nantucket Historical Association, of which I was the president of the board for 9 years. And that organization preserves and protects the stories of Nantucket and our long history. Going back before the whaling days, there's so many more stories about Nantucket than just whaling. But those are the two most recent boards.
Your memoir is called Abandoned at Birth. Without spoiling too much about the book, can you tell us more about it?
Absolutely. I'm an adoptee, and I was adopted during what's referred to as the baby scoop era. So those of us adopted in the 1950s through the 70s, that term is used to define those mostly closed adoptions. And that was the most determining factor of my life. And I wrote the memoir. It's a memoir that I wrote, and I wrote it to not only try and capture the feelings of being adopted, that the untethered, sort of lost, alone, big black hole in the center way that most adoptees feel, so that other adoptees would have their feelings affirmed. But I also really wanted to try and explain to people who weren't adopted what it feels like, because it's a hard thing to understand if you haven't experienced that. It's so different from being part of a family and having your lineage and connection. And yet today we're still being asked to vote on and have opinions about issues that definitely affect those of us from the baby scoop era. For instance, in 40 states, all the birth records and adoption records are still sealed, which virtually says I was adopted in the state of New Jersey. And in New Jersey, it's still illegal for me to know who I really am, where I came from. My records are still sealed, and yet my birth and adoptive parents are all deceased. And I'm well past middle age. And we are also facing new issues, such as those who are donor-conceived individuals and are fighting to know more about their father's side of the family. And people don't understand why that's important. So I wanted to explain this feeling of being untethered and lost and not knowing who you are. And that really prompted why I wrote the book and what I hope people will get out of the book.
The next two questions I'm going to ask are going to provide our listeners a better understanding about closed adoptions, which was the type of adoption that you were adopted through. What is a closed adoption? How does it differ from an open adoption? And how do closed adoptions, which were especially prevalent in the baby scoop era in the mid to late 20th century that you've referenced, contribute to the sense of detachment and longing experienced by adoptees?
The closed adoption is where all records about the birth of the child and the adoption are sealed, and the adoptee themselves aren't ever allowed to know. The birth parent doesn't know who adopted the child. The adoptive parents don't know who the birth parents were. and the child, the adoptee, it's one of the fallacies I'd like to address, but we always say adopted child, and yet we, like me, grow up to be fully functioning independent adults. We are no longer children, but somehow adoptees still have that image of being a child or helpless, and we are certainly not. And we never are allowed to know who we really are, where we came from, what family we descended from, what our heritage is. So, for example, I had no idea growing up what my ethnicity was, where I came from, why I was given up. I never saw anyone who looked like me. It's very important in child development to see yourself mirrored in your family members, and your history. You sort of understand yourself better through that. And we who are adopted don't have that. We don't see anyone. We don't know. We can't help put ourselves together. We can't sort of figure it out and find our core and develop a strong sense of self. And in open adoptions, they have varied over the years since they began. And I did not experience that, so I'm not an expert on that by any means. But in many times, the birth parent has a hand in choosing the adoptive family. And after the child is adopted, there can be open exchange, visitations, or information passed. It sort of depends on how they're structured, but there's acknowledgement of an acceptance of the birth family, and the birth family and adoptive families communicate. And I think that's certainly a step in the right direction. I think it's, I think it's critical for adoptive families to recognize, and adoptees to recognize and acknowledge the family they were born to, their DNA, their heritage, and to acknowledge and value and respect that and incorporate that into their relationship. There's something that happens when you don't share blood with someone else. I call it an almost animal type understanding. There's something that happens on the cellular level, in my opinion, when you are with family. You just feel like you belong. You sort of recognize there's something. It's like animals who recognize their offspring when when there may be 100 offspring that to us might look all the same. They know who their babies are. There's something cellular that happens there, and when you don't have that, you feel it. I mean, I had a perfectly fine adoptive experience by most stretches of the imagination, and yet I felt from the time I was a child that something's off, something's missing, something's different. And there were four of us in my family growing up. We were all adopted, and sitting around the dinner table, we all were participating there, but we didn't belong to each other. There was just a difference. We were all from different DNA, and when you don't understand that or respect that or talk about that, you feel the off. Something's off, something's wrong. What is it? Is it me? And I would also think that for adoptive parents, they feel that detachment. And yet, if it's not being talked about and not being addressed, they're like, oh, what's wrong with me? Am I not parenting well? Is there, on both sides of the coin, people are wondering what they're feeling, and they're not identifying it and speaking to it. And that leads to a lot of misunderstanding and difficulties that don't necessarily need to be there if they were confronted and talked about and faced.
Your search for your biological mother began with a false narrative provided by the adoption agency, and that sounds like something that would be common in closed adoptions. How did
Yeah.
these false details impact your journey, and what advice would you give to others navigating similar situations?
I think it's very common to have had those false narratives. One of the things that I think your previous question asked and I didn't address is why the closed adoptions. What created that? And it was a culture of shame. In those years, it was still considered so shameful to have premarital sex, to have a baby out of wedlock, that the laws were created to protect the mother. Usually it was the birth mother primarily they were thinking about, and her family from this horrible shame of illegitimacy. And yet, and oftentimes the laws were also there to protect the not the privacy of the adoptive parents. Many times back in those eras, adoptive parents didn't tell people their children were adopted. And so you had parents on both sides who had needs that really were more out of a culture of shame than, and no one at that time was thinking about the needs of the adoptee. The human being that was being created and handed from, mysteriously from one family to another family, what is that person going to need as they grow up and become an individual? It was the needs of the two sets of parents and the morality of the two sets of parents that was being judged, either, poor morality or sainthood because they were adopting children. But no one was really examining, what does the adoptee themselves need as they grow up to be a healthy adult, to be a healthy person? Adoptees have 4 times the suicide rate as the normal population. There is a trauma there, and the adoptees' needs have been really left out of the conversation and certainly out of the legal system in trying to address what an individual needs to grow up and become an intact and healthy human being. So again, that just going back to your previous question about why that started, and I'm sorry, I've now lost my train of thought about what you were asking me.
I'll move on to the next question. How difficult was it for you personally to write your memoir, and how long did it take you to write the book once you started writing it?
So it took 3 years to put it all together as a book. I had been writing bits and pieces of this probably my whole life, or certainly my whole adult life. When something major happened, I would write about it, but I didn't know what to do with that. I was very cognizant of my adoptive parents' feelings, and I really didn't allow myself to write this book until they were gone. And sometimes I'd laugh at myself and go, well, you'd be so lucky to actually write a book and then get it published. What are you thinking about here? But it was really, and I know many of us who are adopted feel the same way. We are so afraid of hurting our adoptive parents. We feel we're so grateful for being taken in. We have such poor self-esteem from having been abandoned and given away. You're so grateful to have been taken in that you're not allowed to truly express your real feelings and to truly express yourself, because you're still burdened by that sense of gratitude towards your adoptive parents and love. There's genuine love there too, and respect. It's not just a burden of gratitude. But so I had been writing bits and pieces for decades. It took me 3 years of sitting down to really work on the book. And it was very difficult, but very transformative. And I'm always telling people now that they should write their life story. We all have a life story. And I found that pulling this thread of my life together in a book and putting this story together and sort of concentrating my life and just focusing on this aspect of it for the book. Even though I thought about adoption every day of my life, I've studied it. I did independent studies in college and I've read everything I could get my hands on it. I've been in therapy a lot. Still, the impact of writing the book and sort of putting it all in one place and looking at it all at once gave me a much deeper understanding of the loss and the grief and the sorrow, and had me reprocess or further process what the experience had been for me.
The publisher of your memoir is Forefront Press. Is Forefront Press a self-publishing company, a hybrid publisher, a small traditional press, or an imprint of a larger traditional publishing company?
Forefront is a hybrid press, and it was started. I'm sorry. It's a. I'm just grabbing for a name in my head and I'm blanking on it. But Forefront was started by Jonathan Merck, and he was with Simon and Schuster for many years, and then started Forefront. And Simon and Schuster does the printing and the distribution of the book, but Forefront was the publisher.
Did you face any challenges in getting your memoir published? And if so, what were some of them and how were you able to overcome them?
I didn't face any challenge. I mean, I had to do a lot of research and just, okay, I've written this book. Now what? And it was very discouraging when I started asking people. I didn't know anyone in the industry and started asking people about it. And, still had in my mind what may have been the old traditional road of finding an agent and having them shop the book around for years, and then maybe it'll get picked up and maybe it won't. And people were directing me to hybrid publishers. I knew there could be there was self-publishing, and I was getting kind of overwhelmed with all the, how is this going to happen, and how am I going to do this? I had a friend who had published a book, and he generously referred me to someone that he had worked with, who said, I know someone in publishing, I know a publisher who would be interested in this story, who's had a personal experience in this story. And he connected us, and that led to Forefront Publishing. So I was very fortunate with the kindness of others to be sort of directed to someone who was interested in the topic of adoption, and put the book forward to Forefront.
How do you envision conversations about rights, loss, grief, belonging, and identity that your book and your story inspires, contributing to broader societal understanding and change?
I would hope that the conversations that this book opens, of really people understanding what it feels like to be untethered, what it feels like to not know who you are or where you came from, how traumatizing that is, and how difficult to form yourself with that loss of anyone you're connected to, with anything that helps define you. And when they understand that, and they more than intellectually understand it, when they feel it, hopefully by reading the book, and feel that when their state maybe has an election, and one of the issues is, should we open the birth records of these eras, they're informed enough, emotionally informed enough, and intellectually informed enough to make a decision on that. That's because many people don't know what adoption is like. And let's think about that issue not as the shame of someone from the 1950s, but the people that were most affected by this, the adoptees themselves. What do they need? And make their decision about voting yes or no on that issue, because they've been really have more emotional intelligence about the issue. Or when they're listening to the debates for donor conceived individuals, or when they're trying to understand friends or family members who have gone through this experience, they just bring a greater emotional understanding that will help inform them on not only decisions that they may be asked to make at a voting booth, but in conversations that we can sort of raise the awareness of all of us to the experience of other people that we may not have ever really stopped to think about or had reason to wonder about.
What advice do you have for others who were adopted at a very young age and are now adults going through their own search for their biological parents?
I'd say to keep at it and to do it. I think it's a lot easier nowadays with the DNA websites. I know a lot of people are finding family members or finding information about their families through the DNA websites that were not available when I was going through this. I think one of the questions you had asked me earlier is the misinformation I had been given by my adoption agency earlier, and what advice would I have to others? And that is to not trust anything you're given from a large agency or an agency. In fact, there's so much misinformation out there. There are even situations where the birth parent gave the wrong name because they were just so afraid of ever being found out. So one of my pieces of advice would be, don't trust anything, any one piece of information that you have. Know that it's really important. I think it's critical to adoptees to search and to know where they came from, and to understand their connection to their biological families, and get help when you need help. And of course, nowadays there are these new threads we can pull on, the DNA websites. But also know that it's going to be a very emotional and very impactful journey, and you're going to need support. And so if you have family members or friends or therapists or teacher or minister, but make sure that you have people around you that you can talk to on this because there's going to be a lot to process, but it's so important to you to do so. And so just keep at it. Keep that, listen to that drive inside of you. There's usually a drive in us to find out who we really are. And listen to that drive, respect that drive, pull on every thread and see it to the end, see it come together.
Janet, thank you for appearing on Apollo Papyrus. You were an unbelievably insightful guest.
Thank you for having me. I appreciate it and appreciate your addressing this important topic.
I wholeheartedly thank Janet for appearing on this podcast, and her story was important to tell. This is Aaron Apollo Camp reminding y'all to write and read your passion. Bye for now. Remember to subscribe to the Apollo Papyrus YouTube channel at www.youtube.com/@ApolloPapyrus and the Apollo Papyrus Substack newsletter at apollopapyrus.substack.com. Y'all can visit the Apollo Papyrus website at campaaronapollo.wixsite.com/Apollo Papyrus and follow Apollo Papyrus on Threads, Instagram, Facebook, and Tumblr at Apollo Papyrus. Copyright 2024, Aaron Apollo Camp, all rights reserved. This podcast episode is intended for the private listening of our audience. Any reuse or retransmission of this episode without the express written consent of the podcast host is prohibited, except under fair use guidelines. Royalty-free music and sound effects obtained from https://www.zapsplat.com.